This is Democracy,
a podcast about the people of the United States.
A podcast about citizenship,
about engaging with politics and the world around you.
A podcast about educating yourself on today's important issues
and how to have a voice in what happens next.
Welcome to our new episode of This is Democracy. Today's episode focuses on the John Birch Society, which was quite well known, quite infamous in the 1960s and 70s, sort of fell off the radar screen, but has now become a more important subject of study and political analysis for our understanding of American democracy and the challenges American democracy faces today. The John Birch Society is a far right-wing group, and it's a group that has connections to the world that we deal with today. We're fortunate to have with us a well-known historian who has written what I think is the best book on the John Birch Society and those who were a part of it and those who are connected to it one way or another. The book is titled Birchers, How the John Birch Society Radicalized the American Right. And the writer and historian and friend is Matthew Dallek. Matt, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me and for the kind introduction.
Matt is a historian and professor of political management at George Washington University's College of Professional Studies. He's the author of numerous books that I recommend to all of you. The first book of his that I read, which I think is the first book he wrote, is The Right Moment, Ronald Reagan's First Victory and the Decisive Turning Point in American Politics. This was actually one of the first really serious studies of Reagan's influence on American politics from a historical perspective. Recently, Matt published about 5-6 years ago a really important book on the origins of Homeland Security, how we think about Homeland Security in our society. It's called Defenseless Under the Night, the Franklin Roosevelt Years and the Origins of Homeland Security. Really important for those interested in understanding how we conceive of Homeland Security in our society. And then most recently, as I already said, he's published just a few weeks ago, Birchers, How the John Birch Society Radicalized the American Right. Matt also publishes frequently in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, Politico, and many, many other publications. So he's not only a scholar of the past, but an observer, a keen observer of the present. And that's, I think, one of the strengths of his book and one of the strengths of what we'll be able to talk with him about today as we think about who the John Birchers were, where this far-right radical group came from, and what effect it had on and continues to have on our democracy. Before we turn to our discussion with Matt, though, we have, of course, our scene-setting poem from Mr. Zachary Suri. What's the title of your poem today?
L'chaim.
Is that the title of your poem, or are you just wishing
That's the title of the poem.
Okay. Let's hear it.
Quite cold and quiet, they are marching past the gates, crowding into subway cars and walking past the windows of department stores. The scene is stagnant, though they move together in some jagged step, as if ice were tearing at their mustaches and frost turning their long beards gray. Gray beards, they have forgotten whence they came, that they too once smiled at the old men in their trench coats, counting their steps and forgetting to look at the sun. There is a certain banal audacity in this little charade of life, in the slow turn of revolving doors, their grim faces reminiscent of the revolver that stared me awake on one of those grim deportation nights, or the small whip of fire that consummates their perverse, burning cross bacchanals. Look me in the eyes. I will give you a real smile, because I know someday there really will be ice in their beards, one of those cold, eternal nothing freezes that bring even kings to their knees. May it be so. And together we'll go dancing on their frosty lawns, singing some ditty about roses or the beginning of love.
There's quite a lot you've packed into that poem, Zachary. What is it about?
I think it's about trying to confront one of the seeming paradoxes of the John Birch Society and of the far right in the mid-20th century in the United States, which is how they both embraced a sort of very conservative kind of American conformity in a post-war sense, but then also politically were these violent radicals.
Yeah.
And trying to come to terms with how someone can both be, as we stereotypically think, a sort of typical suburban American, a corporate office worker, but also have this violent and terribly hateful streak at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation, and it's at the center of your book, Matt. Your reaction?
It's a wonderful poem. I would love you to send it to me. I mean, it really captures, and I love your analysis of it. I mean, it really is one of the themes of the book, and frankly, one of the ideas that was so interesting to me as I did my research, which is that, it's a puzzle, right? How can, as I say, these colossi, men, the founders especially, who bestriding the world's most dynamic economy, how can they look at the country that, basically gave them so much and say, they're enemies who are overrunning us, and everything here is kind of twisted and distorted from within, and yet, look how successful and powerful we are. And so that tension is a paradox, and I try to address it in the book.
And you use this phrase from the very beginning, radical conservatives or conservative radicalism. I think you use it both ways. Those seem like contradictory terms, don't they?
Well, they do. Although, it depends, I guess, on what means by conservative, right? What is and what does radical mean? Conservative, at least in a kind of mid-20th century context for a lot of conservatives, did not necessarily mean conserving, let's say, the welfare state, or did not mean necessarily conserving, U.S. foreign policy as it was defined in World War II or the early Cold War. It meant upending, right? And so, but of course, the Birchers themselves, one of the reasons that I say that they were radical or ultra conservative is that they had believed in conspiracy theories, explicit racism, an isolationism, kind of hearkening back to early 20th century, the old right, and a more apocalyptic, violent mode of politics. And those things, and so their beliefs were really on the fringe and put them in a pretty radical place.
For those young listeners of ours, or perhaps older listeners as well, who might have no idea what the John Birch Society is, where did this group come from, and what did they become?
Yes, absolutely. So the Birchers, as big as they were in the 1960s, a kind of household name, nowadays, right, they still exist, but, they're kind of a shadow of their former selves. So the Birchers were founded in December of 1958 by a former candy manufacturer named Robert Welch. And they were named after an evangelist turned Army intelligence officer who was killed by Mao's communist forces 10 days after the end of World War II. He was seen as, this guy, John Birch, seen as the first victim of World War III. And the society basically developed chapters, 20-person, capped at 20 people. They started to spread all around the country, and they were devoted to, at least officially, educating the masses, the American public, about the internal threat of communists that, according to at least the Birch leaders, had begun to overrun America's institutions and was 60 or 70% on the way toward complete domination of American life.
So what was it that attracted people to this new organization founded by a candy manufacturer, and what did they do as they built this organization?
Well, one thing that attracted the kind of elites, the industrialists, and the very wealthy people who joined was that they knew Robert Welch, they knew people in the National Association of Manufacturers, they shared a hatred of the New Deal, a hatred in some of the cultural directions of American life, and a sense that the U.S. Should not have been involved in World War II or had lost the peace or had lost basically the war against the communists. So they shared those kinds of personal and ideological sensibilities. For a lot of other Americans, sort of upwardly mobile suburban professionals, as one Bircher said, the Birch Society is the, quote, answer to every anti-communist prayer. What did he mean by that? Well, he meant, I think, that the society enabled people to take action in their communities against the communist menace. So instead of just talking about communism, instead of just lamenting that communists and their allies had made inroads, the society allowed people to act. And in fact, Robert Welch and the Birch Society, the headquarters, one of the innovative things they did is to give members opportunities to go out in their community and take over a school board or a PTA or protest or a warrant or put stickers up. So people felt empowered, right? They felt like they could actually do something, and that was one of the, I think, attractions.
And this is the point, actually, very early in your book, Matt, where the parallels to today just jump out. Before we get into that, in terms of tactics and goals and activism, how many people at the height of the Birch movement, how many people belong to this organization?
The best estimates are 60 to 100,000 members in the mid-1960s, 64, 65, around the time of Barry Goldwater's presidential campaign and shortly thereafter. But it's been hard for historians and contemporaries at the time to get a real handle on the numbers because the society was quite secretive about its membership. The membership was, I think, constantly in flux. As I said before, they had these small chapters, so it was really hard to track, who was a member, who wasn't. But it gives you a sense, 60 to 100,000, not that many in a country with more than 100, well over 100 million people at the time. But as I argue, they demonstrated that 100,000 or 60,000 of members who were devoted to a cause, who were willing to kind of volunteer their time, put themselves and their money on the line, could have an outsized impact on politics and on political debate in a way that maybe millions of voters could not.
I think, Matt, this is one of the real insights in your book, one of the many contributions, but the one that really stuck with me is how they could have so much influence, yet have such a relatively small number of core members. And you remind us in the book of a historical episode that we've largely forgotten, even as historians, which is the Impeach Earl Warren movement, which I think is one of these moments that encapsulates the influence of a small extreme group. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, it's such an interesting moment. So one of the Birch Societies, the Birch Society actually very early on set up front groups. And the reason they did that was to kind of hide their tracks so as to not let the communists, that was their thinking, right? Not let the communists know who was behind a particular action. And Impeach Earl Warren was one of the earliest in the early 1960s acts that they undertook. But it was arguably the most effective, or one of the most effective. And what they did is essentially launch a campaign using billboards. They erected billboards, I think, all across the country, or many parts of the country. A lot of people did it at the local chapter level. I think I have one Birch member who helped fund 20 of these billboards. And these became a kind of iconic image of the time, because people saw them, right? Remember, there was no social media in the early 1960s. And so, people would see these billboards. It was talked about. And the idea of impeaching Earl Warren, the Chief Justice of the United States, who was considered a giant, right, in American politics. He was governor of California earlier, and a giant in the judicial system, was really radical. And even some conservatives said, that's going too far. The other point I'll make about it, though, is that what was kind of innovative about it, too, is that impeach Earl Warren. Well, what did that mean? Well, for some Birchers and Birch supporters, it meant Brown versus Board of Education. It meant that Warren deserved to be impeached because he had trampled on states' rights, and he had basically destroyed what they called the right, the freedom to segregate by race in their states, in their towns. But to other people also it meant they did not like Warren's jurisprudence on banning prayer in schools, giving rights to criminal defendants, all of the kind of what we think of today as these sort of cultural hot button issues, and impeach Earl Warren could encompass all of these pieces, and some were motivated by one piece and others another, and it really was I think a powerful and memorable, and also Warren himself apparently was not a fan of this movement.
Whenever I think of the John Birch Society and of the impeach Earl Warren movement, I think of the scene in Slaughterhouse-Five, the great novel of the 60s, in which the protagonist, Billy Pilgrim, who has seen the horrors of World War II, drives around with bumper stickers supporting the John Birch Society and the impeach Earl Warren movement. In what sense do you think that the society is born out of a unique mindset of the World War II generation and of that period post-war? And in what sense do you think maybe there are parallels between that generation or that moment and our own today?
And I just have to say, I love anytime we can bring Kurt Vonnegut into the
I mean, it's such a great question. And it's so interesting, too, because I read Slaughterhouse-Five many years ago, but I'd forgotten, I didn't remember that there was a Birch Society reference or a Bircher character in there. The first thing I'll say is that it evokes the extent to which in the 1960s, the Birchers penetrated the popular culture. And Jeremy, earlier you had asked too about, 60 to 100,000, not that many, but yet they had this huge impact. Well, people knew about them, right? Dr. Strangelove, one of the characters in there, Bob Dylan did a song talking John Birch Paranoid Blues. So, Slaughterhouse-Five. So, you see the way in which they became like a cultural trope, and both to be made fun of, but also to be supported. In terms of the post-war generation or the World War II generation, look, I think one point to make is that, and as historians have argued for a long time, the 1950s were not exactly this harmonious consensus cultural era. There was no real hegemony within American society. There were deep divisions. And, you see the Birchers, I think, coming out of not just World War II, but also the New Deal, and frankly, the progressive era, if we're going to go back further. And they have a sense of a lost America, right? An America that had vanished. And it had vanished in part because of the growth of the welfare state, the encroachment, as they saw it, of civil rights, judicial intervention and overreach, and also the international liberal internationalism, right? American engagement in the world. One of their biggest slogans was "Get the U.S. out of the UN." Well, that was born out of the World War II, of course, and the immediate post-World War II era. So I think it's a really perceptive question, because they really were born in a sense, and they were propelled by this sense that there had been decades of really big changes in the structure of American life, American politics, but also America's role in the world, and that those changes were fundamentally flawed and actually alien, right? That they were alien to the Constitution, alien to the country. Birchers had a slogan that's apropos of your podcast, which is we're a democracy, we're a republic, not a democracy. Let's keep it that way. And that, I think, evokes some of their mission. I can talk a little bit about comparisons to today, but
well, there's such an obvious one there, of course, with certain individuals. For example, Senator Mike Lee from Utah today, who's made exactly the words you used would be very familiar to him, that we're a republic, not a democracy. But before we get to that, I want to get at the kind of root issue that you really address so well in the book. And you do it by evoking, of course, a historian that so many of us revere, who was writing at this time, Richard Hofstadter. And he, of course, famously wrote about status anxiety and a paranoid style in American history. Is that what this is? Is this part of a sort of long-term American affiliation or ascription to paranoia, conspiracy, a sense that those who don't feel they're controlling power, that they use conspiracy to delegitimize those who are using power in different ways?
I think that maybe that's one aspect of the book and kind of some of the themes of the book. I mean, Hofstadter has to inform whether one agrees or disagrees with him. He's really seminal, and he informs anyone who's writing about the modern American right. I tend to shy away from the use of the word paranoid in the book because, well, it's clinical and also it's pejorative. What I also resist is trying to define the Birchers primarily through conspiracy theories, because at the time they were known for Robert Welch's, the founder's theory that Dwight Eisenhower was a dedicated agent of the communist conspiracy. And that's or fluoridation in the water supply was a communist plot. But, as I argue in the book, the Birchers also tapped into other ideas. Now, conspiracies sometimes were woven through them, but not always, right? Sex education in the schools. What were students learning? What were the books that were on offer in the libraries? Isolationism, a more explicit form of racism than a lot of political actors at the time were used. And so, and again, this more apocalyptic mode of politics. So conspiracy theories were an element of it. And but I do think that it goes beyond that, and that it has, and Jeremy, this, of course, intersects with your work as well, right? These sort of much deeper roots in American history and a kind of, concerns about sovereignty and nativism and as I said, isolationism that, I think the Birchers kind of captured that as well. So I'll just say I don't want to reduce it, right, to a kind of paranoid conspiratorial style.
Right. No, it's obviously a cocktail of many things. And of course, and you talk about this in the book, white supremacy is part of that too. So one of the traditional things historians and before historians, journalists at the time wrote about were the ways in which it appeared that leading Republican Party figures, Goldwater, but certainly also Ronald Reagan, leading party intellectual William F. Buckley, it appeared on the surface that they were separating themselves from the John Birch Society. Most of them, as you describe in the book, at one moment or another criticized the leaders of the party, particularly Robert Welch. But you argue in the book pretty forcefully that, in fact, they continued, these Republican Party leaders, to try to bring Birchers into the fold, and they tried not to alienate them. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, well, I try to capture in the book what I see as a tension within the conservative coalition. So just to back up, right, I argue that there is a significant dividing line between these ultra-conservative fringe Bircher types and mainstream conservatives, the electorally successful figures actually ranging from Eisenhower to Goldwater and Reagan. And that line was ideological and stylistic, and that they were actually antagonistic to one another oftentimes, right? That, the Birchers and then their successors often distrusted and felt frustrated by these governing conservatives. And I try to capture that dynamic. At the same time, I say, well, a lot of these conservative figures, we're talking about maybe the Bushes, right, father and son, Ronald Reagan, even Bob Dole, at times, especially during their campaigns, they did send signals to what I call these successors to the Birch movement. They sent signals that they were with them, right, that they were on their side, that they were going to champion their agendas. And yet, once they got into office, they often governed in a way that frustrated the fringe's most insistent demands. Immigration, for example, internationalism, right? Interventionism in wars, free trade, conspiracy theories, right? For the most part, people like Reagan did not govern in any of those ways. And in fact, not just the Birchers, but a lot of their what I call their successors were very upset with Ronald Reagan, especially in his second term. They looked at him as a sellout and a traitor. And as one Bircher said, and I think I quote him in the book, he said, a true Bircher never really trusted Ronald Reagan. And they viewed him really ultimately as part of the problem. And so I think it was a kind of tense dynamic, but I think it's also a mistake to lump together these electoral conservative Republicans and the more fringier people.
Right. But I think what resonated with me, at least, were the ways in which you discuss how members of the party at the leadership level, who were disgusted by a lot of what the Birch Society did, particularly those who were disgusted by their attacks on Dwight Eisenhower, for example, nonetheless tried to ride that horse, right? Tried to still appeal to them and not renounce them. And I underline this in my book because it resonates so much with what we saw in Charlottesville in recent years and elsewhere. Repeatedly, you have Barry Goldwater, Republican presidential candidate, William F. Buckley, publisher of the National Review, Ronald Reagan, saying that in spite of the problems of the leaders, the Birchers still had some good people. They were still nice people, just as Donald Trump said in Charlottesville that they were good people on both sides, right? That's very disconcerting to read, I have to say.
Yeah, that's a really the analogy is really powerful as you're describing it. That's true. I mean, look, if we go back, right, Richard Nixon, former vice president, went back to California, ran for governor, and very forcefully denounced the Birchers. Well, what happened to him? He got primaried by a guy named Joe Schell, who took about a third of the primary vote, was not a Bircher, but won the support of a lot of Birchers who were powerful in Southern California, and that really damaged Nixon. So Goldwater came along and had some critical things to say about Robert Welch, knew he was a problem, but as you said, right, he sort of said, I know a lot of Birchers and they're fine people. Reagan in 1966, 4 years after Nixon, kind of split the baby right after Goldwater's landslide defeat. He issued a statement. He said, Welch's theories basically about Eisenhower, I reject those. But if a Bircher supports me, right, or they're buying my philosophy, not the other way around. So that is true, right, that they did. Although, there were times, I mean, I don't want to go too far out here, but there were times when conservatives, especially in office, did, they did not toe the Birch line, right? Even Ronald Reagan, for example, and George W. Bush, right? They signed renewals of the Voting Rights Act or civil rights laws. They, when Reagan said, well, Martin Luther King will know in 25 years if he was a communist, well, he had to backtrack and he apologized for that. He signed the law for reparations to Japanese Americans interned during World War II. So, you can go on down, or George W. Bush, for example. There were a number of instances in which major conservative presidents and other officials governed in ways that were not in sync with the Birch program, and even on a lot of these culture war issues. Someone like Reagan or George H.W. Bush, they would somewhat cynically, especially for Bush Sr., they would go to Jerry Falwell's moral majority groups, and they would say, I support a ban on abortion, or I'm going to, pass let's do a constitutional amendment banning burning of the flag or restoring prayer in school, but they never were able to get it done. And you see the ways in which they governed in ways that a lot of the elements of the fringe did not support. And certainly, when George W. Bush in his second term, when things went south for his presidency and he lost popularity, you see people like Mick Mulvaney and Sarah Palin and Donald Trump, in a sense, who are rejecting him and repudiating many of his policies, and Rush Limbaugh.
What do you think then is the long-term legacy of the Birchers in our contemporary politics?
Well, I argue that they bequeathed, and they were not the only ones, of course, and there were groups in the 1930s, as Father Coughlin or America First, right, and groups obviously before that as well. But the Birchers helped to update and sustain and forge what I describe as this alternative political tradition on the far right. And that even as the Birch Society as an organization peters out, right, it becomes basically a shadow of its old self by the early 1970s. And it's a real epithet at that time. But some of those individuals in the society, and even more importantly, the ideas, as I've said before, isolationism, explicit racism, concerns about sovereignty that we would see make a comeback, this conspiracy theories, and again, this more apocalyptic mode of politics, the idea that the enemy is within, those ideas, that set of ideas on the far right, I think that, and also some of the hardline culture war issues as well, those ideas kind of bubbled along, right? They were picked up by what I argue are these even cannier successors. And there are a lot of other reasons why, the far right sort of makes a comeback. And of course, it's not simply the Birch Society transferred to 2016, for example, but there was this kind of ideological legacy. And even if, someone like a Donald Trump or a Sarah Palin had never heard of the Birch Society, or if they had, they didn't know much about it, they picked up on, very shrewdly in a way, on a lot of the ideas that Birchers and their successors had sustained.
Right. So when you say an alternative political tradition, again, this is in some ways a reference to Hofstadter and others who wrote about inherited American traditions. We think of a Jeffersonian tradition, a Hamiltonian tradition. Your argument, and I think it's a powerful one, is that there is this far right tradition in American history, and that someone like Donald Trump doesn't have to be well read in it to be able to grab onto it and use words that seem legitimate because they are traditional, correct?
Exactly. I mean, that's extremely well put. And, Zachary, in his poem, I think, evoked this as well. And this is one of the points I'm trying to make in the book, that this is a deeply American phenomenon. And it's not just the conspiracy theories, right? It goes beyond that. And because in the 1960s, one of the criticisms lodged at the Birchers was that they were alien. Right, as I think one senator at the time said, they're a weird presence in America. And, my argument is, no, actually, they're not. They're kind of endemic to the country and to its traditions. They're not necessarily the majority of the country, but they're a powerful tradition. And I think it's a tradition that, since especially the New Deal and then the Great Society and Civil Rights Movement, that many people have thought, many, especially liberals, but also some conservatives too, a tradition had really just been marginalized, right? It was not possible to, there's no electoral support. And that's partly why a lot of conservative figures thought that, if you do what Trump did and you call neo-Nazis fine people, as Trump did essentially, that you cannot, you're not going to be elected. And so that assumption, of course, proved incorrect. And here we are.
It's stunning, and I just want to lay this out because I didn't understand this till I read your book, and I think it's why people who want to understand today's politics need to read your book, Matt. Just the number of parallels, and they're not parallels because Donald Trump went back, his supporters went back to look at the 1960s and 70s as you have so carefully in your research, but because these arguments were out there, they were discredited, but at the same time they were available to be used in other moments when they could be made to seem logical and seem less outrageous. So you talk, for instance, about the parallels between the criticisms of Tony Fauci and the criticisms of vaccines, and the parallels with the Bircher criticism of fluorinated water and all the lies that were told about that. Immigration issues, prayer in schools. Mm-hmm. You have a number of lines where Birchers Birchers are arguing for legislation to protect and in some ways almost require prayer in schools. And then look at the legislation in my state of Texas right now. It's almost word for word, Matt.
Yeah, well, I mean, or Florida, right, for that matter, right? I mean, some of the stuff about banning certain teachings, right, progressive teachings. The idea that, these teachings are not just bad for kids, but you're actually indoctrinating them with a socialistic, woke ideas, right? I mean, as contemporaries would put it. Well, that's a similar argument to what the Birchers made in the 1960s. And your point, I think, is exactly right. Someone like Trump doesn't have to be a historian of the far right. I mean, the birtherism conspiracy theory, right? That somehow Barack Obama was not born in the United States and ineligible to be president, that he was an alien to the shore. Well, that there were a lot of other people on the far right who were also pushing that as well. Trump is very entrepreneurial. And I think he's very savvy politically, and he has picked up on and kind of tapped into a lot of ideas that had been simmering on the far right for decades.
So one of the purposes of our podcast, Matt, and I know one of the purposes of your book, one of the things you and I share as historians, is that we believe that history is useful. It's not a roadmap for the future, but it gives us a better sense of the right questions to ask and of some of the things we need to consider in our approach to policy and our approach to social development. What should we do going forward then, based on this history? This clearly indicates that the challenges to our democracy today are not just about Donald Trump or just about Marjorie Taylor Greene. There's something deeper here. So what are the implications of that knowledge for thinking about protecting democracy today?
Well, it's a great question. I think first, just an appreciation that the United States has faced anti-democratic movements in the past, and that these movements may not have been mainstream in the way that they are today, but that it is a kind of enduring part, right, of American life. And having that appreciation in and of itself, I think, is a little bit, I don't know if reassuring is the right word, but it does put in perspective, right, that, as you said so well, Jeremy, that, Trump is not a sui generis, right, that we have seen these kinds of challenges before. The other element, I think, and, it's not quite a lesson because our times are so much different from the 1960s and 70s, but it is worth thinking about. And I actually wrote an article in the Atlantic magazine about this, which is, how do far-right organizations and far-right movements get constrained, right? The Birch ideas never died, but the Birch Society did fade. As I said earlier, right? It faded as an organization and as a movement certainly by the early to mid-1970s. Well, how did that happen? A couple things. One is American institutions, government institutions, mass media, but also civic society, right? The NAACP, Americans for Democratic Action. Most importantly, the Anti-Defamation League. A lot of folks, a lot of groups worked to constrain the Birchers, to really push them out in the fringes, to make them toxic in the political culture. The other point I would make is that the Birch Society, I argue, especially in the late 60s, self-combusted because its conspiracy theories in particular drew more violent and more bigoted members to the ranks. There was internal dissent, internecine warfare, and they also had some financial problems, and it was a very hard movement to sustain. It became incredibly fractious, and and it seemed more and more toxic, even to some of its own members. So it's not a prescription per se, but it is worth thinking about. Look, maybe there are elements of MAGA that, Trump's dinner, for example, with Nick Fuentes and Ye, the rapper, the anti-Semite, the white supremacist dinner that he had a few months ago. There is a way in which I think Trump and MAGA has descended. And again, you don't want to make predictions, but one can see this kind of radicalization and descending that occurred. And, that is, I think, a note, a faint note, but a note of hope.
Absolutely. And I think just to underline one of the many excellent points you just made, Matt, I think for me, one of the big takeaways from your research and your writing is how important organizations that care about democracy, that care about inclusion, grassroots organizations, how important they are. One of the heroic organizations in your book is the Anti-Defamation League, known to many as the ADL. I don't want to give away the whole book, but I encourage those who are interested to read those sections of the book where you talk about a number of measures, including spying undertaken by these organizations to help federal authorities and help state authorities deal with the threats of hatred and violence. And there's a lot to learn from that, I think.
I think that's exactly right. And the thing is, too, in mid-20th century America, even in the 1960s, J. Edgar Hoover and others in law enforcement were more interested in trying to ferret out alleged communists in American society. They were less interested in going after, far-right groups that may have promoted racism and anti-Semitism. And so it was even more important then for a group like the ADL to fill that gap, right? Because it was a real void. And today, I think, fortunately, at least under the Biden administration, for example, we have seen a Justice Department that has taken white supremacy and neo-Nazis and those threats seriously after January 6th, of course. And there are a lot of insurrectionists who are sitting in jail right now.
Absolutely. I think about 1,000 of them have been prosecuted. Zachary, you've listened to this conversation. You've thought deeply about this, especially since you read Kurt Vonnegut years ago. And your generation, I know, often feels concerned and maybe even despondent about some of these issues that we see around us, especially as we see states like Texas and Florida also passing legislation that looks to, in some ways, bring some of these Birch ideas into law even. What do you take from this conversation? Do you see optimistic roads forward here?
I do. I think that one thing that this moment in our politics has done for young people is it has laid bare these long threads of far-right hatred and bigotry in American history. And what I think makes that moment in Slaughterhouse-Five so powerful is the irony that a man who had lived through the dehumanizing trauma of modern warfare could do the same thing and be so virulently anti-communist only a few decades later. Right. And I think one of the lessons that we can draw from this history and that story is that we who have lived not necessarily through comparable trauma, but through a lot of dehumanizing trauma and political strife, need to come out of this moment committed to something different, not to a further extreme.
Right. And that's possible, right?
Exactly.
Because, Matt covers this so well. There is the infamous General Edwin Walker, and if we want parallels, he's a parallel to Michael Flynn today, a military hero who actually becomes a fascist. And so I think your point, Zachary, is really well taken on this. Matt, are you optimistic that we can learn these lessons?
I mean, Zachary, I think your point is really powerful. And, thinking about trauma, but then what comes out on the other side. What gives me a hope or optimism is the grassroots and kind of organic activism, especially among young people, whether it's March for Our Lives and the students at Parkland, or people in support of voting rights, all the people who have gone out to vote in the last three national elections. On the Dobbs decision and the reaction to that, and these referendums that we've seen in even conservative states, right, where people are trying to define freedom as the right to choose, right, if a woman wants to get an abortion. So I guess I am optimistic that democracy is incredibly fragile at this moment, as we've seen, and actually is a bit broken in many respects, but it is also resilient as well. And I think it's that kind of tension and may 10, 20, 30 years from now, who knows? Maybe it will be seen as stronger, to Zachary's point, because of the moment that we are living through now. I don't know, that's maybe Pollyannish, but it's not inconceivable.
Well, I think what your research shows, Matt, and this is true actually throughout all three of your books, but particularly your work on the Birchers, which is that American democracy has enormous capacity to learn and react. We don't always see that on a day-to-day basis. But just as the ADL and the FBI and elements of American politics in the 1970s learned to discredit and in some ways eliminate the Birchers as a major political force, that can happen again. And the craziness, the hate that we see in our politics that comes often from small numbers of people who are amplifying their voices, there are things we can do about that. And I think you give us a lot to think about, and you give us a great example of exactly what our podcast is about each week, which is studying the past, learning from the past, not as a recipe for the future, but as an inspiration for new creativity in our politics today. Matt, thank you so much for joining us.
This was such a wonderful conversation, and thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Zach. Your questions were terrific, so it's great to be here.
And Zachary, thank you for your inspiring poem, L'chaim, with a great title also. And thank you most of all to our loyal listeners for joining us for this episode of This Is Democracy.
This podcast is produced by the Liberal Arts ITS Development Studio
and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin.
The music in this episode was written and recorded by Harris Codini.
Stay tuned for a new episode every week. You can find This is Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher.
See you next time.